Spaces in between. Indigenous women leaders speak back to dominant discourse and practices in educational leadership by Tanya Fitzgerald. PowerPoint by Carolyn Roberts. This paper talks about how Indigenous women in leadership roles are trying to live in two worlds, the white dominant colonized world, as well as their own culturally traditional world within their communities. It also talks about the spaces in between as places where conversations can be had. Open, honest, frank conversations about the obstacles these Indigenous women leaders face every day in their roles as school administrative leaders. This paper was written by Professor Tanya Fitzgerald and a community of 15 Indigenous women leaders in schools both in Canada and Australia. Professor Tanya Fitzgerald is the head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and acting head of the School of Education at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Tanya's primary field of research is the history of women's higher education. She has written many books about the struggles that women have occurred within the educational system throughout history, and she considers herself a white feminist academic. So, why is this paper important? It brings to light many key points on how we are going to move forward in reconciliation. It puts forth questions like, how are we going to be supporting female Indigenous leaders in a positive way? And how are we going to be writing papers and leadership materials that Indigenous women can connect with on a deeper level? And how do we move away from the colonized workplaces to a more Indigenous way of being within these workplaces? And where can we have that space for these kinds of discussions to happen? And how do we start? So, what's the paper addressing? What's the problem? Fitzgerald is trying to bring to light the two worlds within Indigenous women are trying to live in, being leaders in a colonized school system and also being connected with their families and communities and land that surrounds them. She speaks to how the colonized system and the Indigenous systems are polar opposite, and what makes a leader in an Indigenous system does not necessarily make a leader in the colonized white culture. The Indigenous women that helped Fitzgerald write this paper talk about how they're feeling about the colonized system of oppression as they work towards being good role models and strong leaders because their community has asked them to step up and be their leader. Yet they are still struggling within this colonized system that does not support their Indigenous ways. These women would like to find the support they need within the current academic literature, but that is not what is out there right now in this moment. Where are the papers that give these women that connection on a deeper level in an Indigenous way that gives them the support they need, or talks about the issues that are holding them back within this colonized system of oppression? These Indigenous women are looking for a space to talk about their struggles and bring their concerns to the table to talk about ways that we can improve the system. So what's the nature of the problem? The voices of these Indigenous women are not heard within the academic papers and leadership materials in the colonized post-secondary institutions of today. These women are trying to negotiate being Indigenous women in their colonized workplaces as school leaders and administrators. They're trying to negotiate being Indigenous and trying to stay true to their culture and their community, but they're living within this box of colonization and the dominant white culture within the workplaces that they work at. So, this article provides a counter narrative on how Indigenous women feel within the leadership roles as they work and live in these two different worlds. It was written to promote and to talk about Indigenous women's voices through theorizing their leadership realities and situating such knowledge in cultural spaces that they occupy. It talks about what we can do as activists, both Indigenous activists and Indigenous ally activists, working together on having voices of the Indigenous women being heard. So, what's the proposed solution to this problem? Fitzgerald states that we can start by speaking back as academics. We can start to bring to the foreground the issues that arise as we move forward in reconciliation. We need to use the spaces in between to talk about how we can support our Indigenous women leaders in their leadership roles. These spaces must be safe, open, and honest spaces for some real discussion to happen. Fitzgerald also says we need more academic papers to be written by Indigenous women leaders so that they can see themselves within these papers, within the system, and stay true to who they are as Indigenous women. There needs to be conversations about the strengths that Indigenous women bring to the table, other than just being Indigenous to fill a quota. From reading this paper, I see the need to support our leaders that are out there living within these two worlds and giving them the tools they need to be successful. So, what can we do? As academic Indigenous women, we can speak up. We can also shout out and make the voices of these Indigenous women leaders be heard. We need to continue to write back and research back in our own Indigenous ways as strong, able Indigenous women that can change the system. We need to allow for these spaces in between to be open, to talk about the challenges that we face as Indigenous people and Indigenous women. We also need the academic writers, that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to write strong academic papers that we can find ourselves within them, to help make our connections to our own stories so that we can move forward and be the great leaders that our community have asked us to be. So, how does this article contribute to the discussion of education? It talks about how education is really, and has mainly been, from only one perspective for hundreds of years, the dominant white perspective. And in order for Indigenous people to create strong leaders, we need to have something within that system that supports our Indigenous knowledge and our Indigenous ways of being. Indigenous leaders are connected to a much larger group. They are part of a community that depends on them as leaders to support the whole community and their family as well. This needs to be supported and addressed within the post-secondary institution. This article also challenges academics to write more articles, to do more research, and have more discussions about Indigenous ways of knowing. Indigenous women need to have articles that they can connect with, reach out, research, talk, knowledge, have these conversations about what we need within the system in order to support us better. We need the space for Indigenous women's voices to be heard. We also need Indigenous allies in order for that change to happen. We need the support of the people that know the system best so they can help change the system to better support Indigenous women in leadership roles. So, what are the limits or the blind spots that I think this paper has? I believe that the articles come from a place that we need the white allies in order for Indigenous women's voices to be heard. This could be, and I understand that it probably does help, but I think we also need to look at doing things in an Indigenous way rather than the white dominant way. We need to look at a system that will work for Indigenous people and our Indigenous ways of knowing. We need Indigenous people to write our own papers in a way that reflect our own knowledge and our own way of being in order for our other Indigenous people to connect with. If Indigenous people continue to try to fit into the dominant, colonized white system, they will never have their true voice be heard because we'll always be trying to fit something in that doesn't fit together. We as Indigenous people have a very unique system and way of being, and we need to find a way within our own knowledge system for us to be supported and heard within the colonized system. So, what are the questions that come to mind to me after reading this article? Is when we talk about leadership roles in an Indigenous way, we need to think from an Indigenous perspective, which is always family and community come first. And what are we going to be leaving behind for our grandchildren? So, how does this equate in a colonized system? How do we talk about this connection of family and community within that system? Can we use Indigenous ways of knowing within that system? I don't know. I think that sometimes it's a square peg being put into a round hole. And when we move forward into this reconciliation and the calls to action, we need to be really mindful of not just putting someone or something in place without supporting it. If we are putting people in power positions just because they're Indigenous with no support system to help manage their positions, then are we really moving the system forward, or are we tokenizing the system and making it look like we're moving forward when really we're not? So, what is real change then? We do need to call out, we do need to shout out, and we do need to make our voices heard within this system. We also need to educate ourselves about the shared history of this land that we live. And we need to start to make history known in order for us to move forward. We need those spaces in between and the discussions for a new hope and a brighter future for our children and our grandchildren. We need your voices, we need our voices, and we need the shared history together in order to move forward. Thank you for sharing some time with me today.